in my opinion, I believe a lot of the more deeper elements of the Final Fantasy VII narrative are a direct result of the game being produced and kind of guided by Hironobu Sakaguchi, the longtime curator of the Final Fantasy series. And he was on board from the beginning, but he eventually was forced to retire early due to the fiasco that was Final Fantasy The Spirits Within, that movie, which cost Squaresoft a lot of revenue. It was a financial disaster, and it directly resulted in Sakaguchi's early departure from the company around 2004. And looking back now, it's pretty clear to me that the series has lost something ever since he left. There was a very unique philosophical foundation that the series drew a lot of inspiration from, both for ideas involving the actual narrative, to the characters, to even the monster names and the different towns. Almost every facet of Final Fantasy's aesthetic used to be influenced by what I can only imagine are aspects of Sakaguchi's personal, spiritual, and philosophical beliefs. It gives me the impression that the man was very well-read and took inspiration from a variety of different world religions, belief systems, philosophies, and he kind of blended it together to create the world of Final Fantasy VII, which itself is, even amongst the other games in the series, a highly original setting for a fantasy game, especially when it's been hybridized with an element of cyberpunk. For me, this is one of my favorite parts of the Final Fantasy VII aesthetic and the themes and the subtext of the game. It's that there is a blending of fantasy and esoterica, that spiritual side of Sakaguchi, blended with materialism. There's this anti-corporate message, there's an anti-globalist message as part of the game. There's a lot of politics, and there's a lot of factions that are inspired by modern political movements. You have Avalanche, who are a kind of eco-anarchist faction. They are terrorists. They do carry out terrorist operations against the status quo, which is the Shinra corporate global regime. You also have the Ancients, and you have Shinra, who are seeking the Promised Land. They're almost a kind of fantasy Zionist faction. But before we get into that, let's start with Avalanche. I just want to take a look at the motivations behind this faction in the game. Now, they are radicals and they are political dissidents. They are motivated by the need to take action against what they view as an exploitative, authoritarian, one-world government. And they have reached the point where they've had enough, and they're willing to actually kill innocent civilians to achieve their ideal. And that's actually very interesting that this would even be included in the game, because it doesn't just paint out Avalanche as being these just heroes that are completely morally righteous. They don't have the moral carte blanche you would think that they would be given, especially in a video game. There are moments when Barret himself, the leader of Avalanche, even he has moments where he feels like he's just gone too far. His hands are stained with blood. In the world of Final Fantasy VII, there is no democratic avenue for Avalanche to achieve their environmentalist goals. Their only option really is violence, because of how corrupt the system actually is. Shinra imposes absolute control on the population of the world. They seem to have a presence everywhere, from Costa del Sol to the desert Badlands, Junon, Midgar, everywhere. And through Barret's backstory, we actually find out how far Shinra are willing to go to acquire this resource of Mako energy, this lifeblood of the planet. Because Shinra view Mako as simply a materialist resource to be exploited. They don't have the more spiritual connection to the planet that the Ancients had, that some of the residents of Cosmo Canyon are aware of, Red 13, Bugenhagen, Aerith, of course. The more spiritual characters of this world, they view Mako as almost sacred. But for Shinra, Mako is the foundation of their empire, and they always need more, they always crave more, because ultimately, without Mako, they would not be able to function. And they're always looking for more sources, and that's what caused them to approach Barret's hometown of Coral, kind of offering this deal, saying, allow us to build a Mako reactor in your town, and you can experience all of the benefits of Mako energy and the modernity that it brings. Look at Midgar, high-tech city. Coral, just a very small mining town. Tight-knit community. And ultimately, they declined. They said, nope, we're miners, we're working class, we're set in our ways, and we don't really need help from a corporation like Shinra. And it was actually Barret's best friend, Dine, the biological father of his adoptive daughter, Marlene, who initially he was very, very anti-Shinra, and he did not want to accept this deal. But it was Barret himself that argued the case for Mako Energy, and he actually convinced Dine, along with the rest of the community, that Mako Energy is the future, that we should totally take this deal. What's the worst that could happen? And it's this decision that really defines Barret's character for me. And it shows how, as a younger man, he was way more naive. He trusted Shinra. He bought the rhetoric. And he believed, okay, this is going to be good for all of us if we embrace globalism and embrace technology, that we can all benefit from it. And it's this decision that really becomes Barret's greatest regret. This is the biggest mistake he ever made, embracing modernity. Because Dine, his best friend and kind of the community leader in this town of Coral, was very skeptical of outsiders, and he was a very tradition-oriented man. So this just shows the dichotomy between Barret and Dine, which I find really interesting. They both lost their arm in the subsequent tragedy, the absolute purge of the town. Shinra burned the town to the ground after the reactor mysteriously exploded. Now, I guess Shinra just assumed that it was sabotage, and they took revenge on the population of the town. And, this is just a horrifying scene in the game when you see Shinra just massacre the entire place and purge all dissidents that would dare resist the new world order that Shinra was imposing. And it's this trauma that really it was the inspiration for Barret to create Avalanche in the first place. He wasn't born a terrorist, but it was this event that pushed him over the edge. But the cool thing about Barret is that he always maintained a softer side because he had to take care of Dine's daughter. And obviously, in the beginning of the game, Barret thinks that Dine has died during this purge. But later on, when you actually return to Coral, you find out that Dine survived, and he just lost an arm, the same as Barret. But the difference between the two men is that Dine has totally succumbed to hatred, that his whole life is revenge. And the same is true for Barret, except that Barret still struggles to preserve part of his soul, whereas Dine, his soul is long since succumbed to just total and absolute nihilism. When Barret informs him that his daughter is still alive, that's what causes Dine to kill himself, that he could never face his daughter, this innocent young girl, after living a life of pure revenge for so long. But ultimately, this just inspires Barret to continue on as an idealist and to not succumb to nihilism. So I just find this entire character arc very cool and very, very edgy at the same time. Because this kind of story of industrial upheaval and corporations taking over communities, this is something that we experience in our real world. And being someone who lives in the UK, this same exact thing, it kind of happened in the north of England, where corporations came in, took over the mining industry, ruined communities, betrayed and devastated the working class. Barret's backstory is some of my favorite political commentary in the entire game. But moving on, let's talk a little bit more about the Shinra Corporation themselves, because they are constantly spreading their influence throughout the world of Final Fantasy VII. And they've actually engaged in war, open war with Wutai, which was a more of an Eastern-influenced country, highly nationalistic, seeking to maintain independence. And it's just that battle, again, between traditionalism, spirituality, modernity, materialism. It's just a core theme of Final Fantasy VII. And when you take a closer look at Shinra, they have a really interesting element that I'm just not sure what Sakaguchi was even going for when he infused Shinra with this allegorical symbolism. Really reminds me of kind of a combination of Gnosticism and Zionism. It's that Shinra, ultimately their main motivation for world conquest is their pursuit of the Promised Land. And that I find really interesting. It's that this neoliberal authoritarian corporation of Shinra Inc., at their core, behind the scenes, even President Shinra himself and his son Rufus, they're influenced by a strange elitist occultism, which is derived from the civilization of the ancients. And obviously, that's a long extinct race of like Hyperborean superhumans. Now, Aerith herself, one of the main characters, she's the last descendant of this race. But the Shinra Corporation, they are very interested in the culture of this ancient race, and ultimately they use this prophecy of the Promised Land as a justification in continuing to expand and dominate and exploit the resources of the world and the lifeblood of the planet. So I find it fascinating that Shinra, they have their corporate face that they put on, and they have their corporate propaganda that they utilize. But behind the scenes, they have their own sense of occultism and prophecy. In the Gnostic tradition, they consider the world kind of like split between the material and then the spiritual. And that there's actually two gods. You have the god of all of the universe, but then you also have the god of the material realm. You can call him Lucifer, you call him the Antichrist, you can call him the Demiurge. But that, for me, that role is fulfilled obviously by the main antagonist of the game, Sephiroth. And there's like a poetic irony to his arc where he was created by Shinra as an experiment, and he was in part cloned from the genetic material of this alien parasitical nightmare creature that crashed into the Earth a long, long time ago. And it was this creature, Genova, that ended up wiping out the race of the ancients to begin with. So Shinra have kind of taken to worshipping this creature, but almost from a more of a scientific, secular perspective. They have this specialist Hojo, who himself is a very unethical and twisted character. He's a man of pure science. And he kind of gives the Shinra Corporation its element of Kabbalic materialism. And it's his dream to create the ultimate hybrid of this awful creature, Genova, and human DNA. So he creates Sephiroth. And what you learn from Cloud's backstory is that initially Sephiroth was indeed the ultimate soldier. He was worshipped and lionized by a lot of the youth of the world of Final Fantasy VII, including Cloud himself. But ultimately, after learning of his own twisted and unnatural origins, Sephiroth he becomes consumed with this dream of achieving godhood. And he does ultimately almost achieve the essence of the Gnostic Demiurge. He just doesn't quite make it, but he gets very close. If you look at his ultimate incarnation at the end of Final Fantasy VII, the last boss, he looks like this godlike creature. He has one angel wing, and he does fully embody the image of the Demiurge at that point. But ultimately, it is that force of nature, that inherent logos of the universe that does defeat him. It's that the planet itself, whatever constitutes nature, eventually does manifest and also combine with Aerith's prophecy of the holy materia. And almost like the religion of the ancients and their influence on the world eventually does come to fruition in that final sequence. And looking at it now, it seems like there is this Kabbalic influence that Sakaguchi has infused into both the Shinra Corporation and also Sephiroth himself. Even his name, it comes from the Kabbalic Sephiroth, which in the Kabbalah religion represent the 10 attributes of the Tree of Life, which is part of this very esoteric Jewish mysticism. And it's very interesting how this Kabbalic tradition has influenced a lot of 90s Japanese pop culture. You see it in stuff like Evangelion, and also another noteworthy Square release back in the late 90s, Xenogears, another game infused with tons of Gnostic, Kabbalic, and Christian imagery and symbolism. And there's even the influence of Norse mythology in some of the game's lore, specifically the name Midgar, which is a corruption of Midgard, the Norse term for the Earth realm itself, the material realm. And there we have it again. It's another reference to these split concepts of material and spiritual. And there's also Nibelheim, which sounds very similar to Niflheim, the Norse realm of primordial ice and cold. So taking all of these different references together, you can see that Sakaguchi was immersing himself in these different elements of the spiritual. And after reading some interviews with him around the time of development, I learned that this was due to the death of his mother, which affected him very deeply and inspired him to give the world of Final Fantasy VII its kind of grounded, dark tone. It's a kind of gritty, realistic fantasy world where good people can die. There is this element of the bittersweet, which kind of informs a lot of the characters' backstories. In fact, almost every character has an element of tragedy in their past. So you can really see where Sakaguchi's head was at during the early stages of development. It gives the game, again, it's that Gnostic concept that the material world is inherently evil, and it's that nature itself is informed by something beyond the physical. And of course, the concept of death within the world of Final Fantasy VII is evocative of a more Eastern way of looking at death. You know, the essence of the living kind of rejoins the planet. It joins this life stream where all of the souls of the dead kind of meld into one, almost like a Jungian collective unconscious, but I guess this is more evocative of like Shinto and Buddhism, reflecting Sakaguchi's roots as obviously a Japanese man. And I've barely scratched the surface when it comes to some of these more obscure references in the game. That's the thing I love about Final Fantasy VII. You can keep on diving and learning more secrets and just discovering more and more of the very esoteric foundation upon which this absolute classic game of the late 90s sits. And obviously the industry has changed quite a bit since 1997. So much so that if we're going to get any political commentary these days, it's going to be through an intersectional lens. There's a lot of feminism, a lot of race theory, Marxist, social and economic ideas that kind of find their way into many AAA titles in the current year. As for metaphysics, forget about it. Gone are the days where the main villains in a AAA mainstream release simultaneously invoke the black magic of the Kabbalah and also the futility and materialistic greed and destructiveness of a Zionist pursuit of paradise on Earth. That Kabbalic materialism is really not the way to live because there is something beyond the physical. That seems to be the game's ultimate thesis, and I gotta say, Mr. Sakaguchi, can you cool it with the anti-Semitism?